Almost nobody dies climbing up a mountain. Nearly everyone who dies on one dies coming back down, exhausted, past the point where their body has anything left to give, after the summit has already stopped being the dangerous part. Every photograph anyone ever takes on this job gets taken on the way up, at the moment of arrival, when the danger is technically already behind the client and quietly still ahead of everyone in the group. 9 ranks separate a guiding apprentice from the small number of people trusted to lead the world's wealthiest clients to the top of the tallest mountains on Earth. And every single one of those ranks is built around a truth beginners never want to hear. The summit was never actually the finish line. It just feels like one, right up until it isn't. Level 1, the apprentice. You're 23, certified in basic rope work and glacier travel, hired for your first season assisting on moderate peaks for roughly $22,000, a number that embarrasses you slightly when relatives ask what the job pays, set against a role that already asks you to help keep paying clients alive on terrain that has genuinely killed people less careless than you're being trained to be. A guide named Freya, weathered and precise in a way that makes her instructions feel less like suggestions and more like facts, runs your apprenticeship personally, and the first real lesson she teaches has nothing to do with climbing technique at all. She has you practice reading a topographic map against real terrain for hours before ever letting you touch a rope with a client attached to it, insisting that judgment about ground has to come before technical skill, or the technical skill becomes actively dangerous in the wrong hands. Turning around is the hardest skill in this entire profession, she tells you, on your first real client trip. Watching you watch a summit that's suddenly technically within reach for a group that's clearly running out of daylight and energy to make it back down safely. You don't turn the group around that day. She does, over your hesitation, and you spend the descent quietly furious at a decision you don't fully understand until 18 months later, guiding your own group, making the same call yourself for the first time. The rest of that first season teaches you more about logistics than about climbing itself, the unglamorous, constant work of checking weather windows, packing and repacking group gear, learning the specific rhythms of clients who spent a year's savings on this single trip and desperately want it to go well, sometimes past the point where wanting it is safe. You develop calluses in places you didn't expect, on your hands and somewhere else less physical, a specific patience for other people's fear that no amount of technical training taught you on its own. Level 2, the assistant guide. You lead easier routes under a certified guide's supervision now. Real responsibility for the first time, clients trusting your rope work and your judgment on terrain serious enough to genuinely hurt them if either fails. Your pay climbs to around $38,000, still nowhere near what the clients themselves are paying for the trip, a gap you notice more sharply this season than you did as an apprentice simply because you're now the one fielding their questions about it. The job starts teaching you a skill nobody mentions in the marketing materials, reading exhaustion and fear in strangers you've known for exactly 3 days, well enough to know which ones will push through a hard stretch and which ones are about to make a panicked mistake that endangers the entire rope team. A client freezes on an exposed ridge during your second season, genuinely paralyzed by fear rather than physically unable to continue, and you spend 20 minutes talking her through the next 40 feet of terrain in a voice you didn't know you had until you needed it. Calm, specific, entirely focused on the next single movement rather than the remaining distance. She makes it. She sends you a letter the following year thanking you for a version of courage she says she didn't know she had until you talked her into finding it. You keep the letter. It's the first time the job feels like something more than technical competence. Not every client story from this season ends as well. A different group member, weeks later, argues with you openly in front of the rest of the rope team about a turnaround call you make on a shorter, less serious peak, accusing you of excessive caution in a tone the rest of the group finds visibly uncomfortable. You hold the call anyway. He doesn't send a letter. You learn, that season, that the job sometimes means being resented by the exact people you're protecting. and that the resentment doesn't change what the correct decision was. Level 3. The Certified Guide. You earn your full certification and start leading independent trips, your name now the one on a client's confirmation email, the responsibility for an entire group's safety resting on your judgment alone rather than a supervisor's. Your pay crosses $55,000, and the actual weight of the certification lands on you slowly over a full season, rather than in any single dramatic moment. A constant, low-grade awareness that every decision from route selection to turnaround time now belongs entirely to you. You make your first real emergency call this season, a client showing early signs of altitude sickness on a peak serious enough that descending immediately is the only responsible choice, against the client's own protests that he's simply tired and can push through it. You get him down to a safer elevation before the symptoms progress further, and a doctor at the trailhead confirms afterward that the descent likely prevented a genuinely dangerous outcome. Freya, reached by satellite phone during the descent for a second opinion you didn't strictly need but wanted anyway, tells you that instinct, once earned, is worth trusting even when a client argues loudly against it. You spend the rest of that season noticing how differently you read a client's face than you did as an assistant guide. Small signs of fatigue and fear registering almost before the client themselves has consciously noticed them. A veteran guide at base camp tells you this read is the actual product you're selling now, more than the summit itself. Clients can watch a mountain from a photograph. What they're actually paying for is someone who can see trouble in them 3 steps before they can see it themselves. Level 4. The High Altitude Guide. You move into serious technical terrain now, peaks that require weeks of expedition-style climbing rather than single-day pushes, altitudes where the air itself becomes a genuine adversary long before any technical difficulty does. Your pay reaches the low 6 figures across a full season, reflecting both the specialized skill required and the significantly increased danger of terrain where mistakes are considerably less forgiving than anything you guided in your first 3 years. You experience your first real close call with altitude illness yourself this season, a slower reaction time and a foggy, dangerous confidence that something is fine when it clearly isn't. Caught only because a fellow guide notices your uncharacteristic clumsiness on a fixed line and insists on an immediate descent you would have argued against 20 minutes earlier. You understand, recovering at base camp, that the mountain doesn't distinguish between a guide's life and a client's, and that the guides who last long careers are the ones who let other people override them exactly as fast as they'd override a struggling client. You change your own protocols after that close call, building in mandatory check-ins with a fellow guide at every camp, specifically so someone else is always watching for exactly the kind of clumsy, foggy confidence that nearly cost you your own judgment. Some of the younger guides you work alongside find the extra layer excessive at first. You keep it anyway, and within 2 seasons it becomes standard practice across the whole outfit, adopted by guides who never had a close call themselves but trust the ones who did. Level 5. The Expedition Leader. You lead full, multi-week expeditions now on some of the tallest peaks outside the very highest tier, managing logistics, staffing, and client safety across the kind of extended timeline where a single bad weather window can unravel months of planning in an afternoon. Your compensation crosses $130,000 per season, and the job expands again. You're not just guiding climbers anymore. You're running an entire operation, coordinating porters, cooks, and support staff whose safety is now also, in a real sense, your responsibility. A rapid weather change strands part of your expedition at a high camp longer than planned, supplies running thinner than anyone's comfortable with, and you spend 3 days making increasingly difficult calls about rationing, rest, and whether a weather window that looks marginal is worth the risk of taking. You wait it out. The window that eventually opens is clean, and the summit push succeeds without incident, though you privately understand how easily the entire outcome could have gone the other way, and how little of the difference between the 2 outcomes was actually within your control. You call Freya from base camp after it's over. Not because anything went wrong, but specifically because nothing did. And you've learned by now that the calls after a clean success matter almost as much as the calls after a hard one. A chance to talk through exactly which decisions earned the outcome and which ones simply got lucky, so you don't confuse the two the next time a similar window looks marginal. She listens to the whole account without interrupting, the way she always does, and tells you, at the end, that the 3 days of patience were the actual leadership. The summit was just the part clients would remember. The porters and support staff on this expedition become people you rely on in ways clients rarely fully appreciate. A cook who somehow produces a hot meal at a camp battered by winds strong enough to flatten a tent. A lead porter who reads the mountain's moods with an intuition built over decades that no guiding certification anywhere teaches. You start paying closer attention this season to how differently their compensation and recognition compare to your own, doing work at least as skilled and considerably more physically brutal than yours, and you don't have a comfortable answer for the gap, only an increasing unwillingness to pretend it doesn't exist. You call your support staff together after the summit push and tell them plainly that the 3 days of waiting mattered more to the outcome than the single day of climbing did, because you've watched newer expedition leaders make the opposite mistake, treating the wait as dead time instead of the actual work, growing impatient in a way that pushes a team toward a marginal window instead of a genuinely safe one. Half your staff have worked with you long enough to already know this. You say it anyway, every expedition, because the ones who don't already know it are exactly the ones who need to hear it most. Level 6, the Elite Peak Guide. You reach the top tier of commercial guiding, leading expeditions on the handful of peaks serious climbers spend entire careers working toward. Altitude where the body is measurably dying with every hour spent there, regardless of fitness or preparation. Your compensation crosses $200,000 per season, funded by clients who spent years and small fortunes preparing for a single attempt, and the responsibility of leading them through terrain this unforgiving becomes, in a way, none of the levels below fully prepared you for, as much a psychological burden as a physical one. You lose a client for the first time in your career at this level, weather and altitude combining in a way that overwhelms even a well-prepared team's contingencies. A loss that happens despite every correct decision your team makes in the moment, the specific kind of outcome this altitude produces more often than anyone in the industry likes to advertise to clients still deciding whether to book the trip. You spend the walk back to base camp rehearsing what you'll say to the family, a conversation that ends up bearing almost no resemblance to what you'd rehearsed, because grief on the other end of a satellite call never follows the shape you prepare for it in advance. Freya, consulted afterward by satellite phone from thousands of miles away, tells you the same thing she apparently tells every guide who reaches this exact call, that the mountain doesn't negotiate with good preparation, and that the guides who survive this part of the career are the ones who can carry a loss like this without it making them either reckless or too afraid to lead the next expedition at all. You lead your next expedition 11 weeks later, a shorter recovery than you'd have chosen if the season schedule allowed for more, and you notice your own hands checking gear more carefully than usual, your voice a shade quieter during the safety briefing than clients seem to expect from someone with your reputation. Nobody on that trip ever learns why. You don't explain it. You simply climb more carefully than you have in years, and the trip goes well, and you allow yourself, cautiously, to call that a kind of proof that the previous loss hadn't broken the part of you the job actually depends on. Level 7, the Private Client Guide. You shift into bespoke expeditions for extraordinarily wealthy individual clients, often pursuing a personal collection of the world's most significant peaks, willing to pay rates that dwarf standard commercial guiding for the highest possible level of individual attention, safety margin, and logistical support money can arrange. Your rates for a single private expedition climb past $300,000, funded by clients whose other assets you sometimes glimpse only in passing, private aircraft, and staff that make the entire operation feel, at moments, more like running a small traveling company than guiding a climb. The work reshapes your relationship to risk in an unexpected way. Client safety margins expand considerably when resources aren't a constraint. More support staff, better equipment, faster evacuation capability if anything goes wrong. And you find yourself, more than once, grateful for a level of institutional caution the earlier, leaner years of your career simply couldn't afford. A client on your third private expedition needs an emergency evacuation for a medical issue unrelated to altitude entirely, and the speed and resources available to handle it, resources a standard commercial trip simply wouldn't have had on hand, likely make the difference between a frightening story and a genuine tragedy. Freya, who moved into private guiding 2 years before you did, tells you the guilt of finding this version of the job genuinely safer than the version that made your name is a completely normal thing to sit with, and that she's never fully resolved it herself either. You start directing a portion of your private client fees toward better pay and equipment for the local support staff on every expedition you lead, a policy some of your wealthier clients barely notice, and a few specifically seek you out for once word gets around. It doesn't close the gap you first noticed as an expedition leader years earlier. It's the only thing within your actual control that narrows it at all, and you've decided, at this level, that partial is better than nothing. Level 8, the Expedition Company Director. You start your own guiding company, built on 2 decades of reputation across the entire arc of commercial mountaineering, employing dozens of guides and support staff across multiple expeditions running simultaneously on peaks around the world. Your company's annual revenue crosses several $1,000,000, and your own role shifts permanently away from personally leading every summit, pushed toward the responsibility of setting the safety standards every guide under your company operates by. You make the difficult call to pull your entire company out of a season on a peak experiencing unusually unstable conditions, a decision that costs the company a genuinely significant sum in refunded client fees and damaged short-term reputation with clients eager to climb regardless of the risk. 2 competing companies operate that same season anyway. Nobody from either company is seriously hurt this time, and you're aware, uncomfortably, that the correctness of your caution and the outcome of theirs are not actually the same measurement, no matter how badly you'd like them to be. A junior guide at your company asks you that same week how you actually make a call like that, with real money and real jobs on the line. And you tell him honestly that you don't have a formula, only a threshold you've built over 3 decades that you trust more than you trust any single season's revenue. He asks what happens if you're eventually wrong, confident and cautious at once, and still wrong. You tell him that's the part of directing a company nobody can train you for in advance. You just carry it, the same way every guide before you carried every hard call on the mountain itself. You field several angry calls from clients that season, some demanding refunds beyond what your policy allows, a few threatening to guide with a competitor permanently. You take every call personally, despite knowing, intellectually, that you shouldn't. And you keep a private file of the decision's reasoning, weather data, and risk assessments, not to defend yourself to anyone, but because you've learned that writing the reasoning down clearly, in the moment, is the only reliable way to trust your own judgment when you revisit a hard call months later without the fear that was present when you made it. Level 9, the legend. There are a small number of names in mountain guiding that younger climbers learn before they've ever roped up themselves. People whose careers spanned the entire commercial evolution of the industry, who trained the guides training the next generation, whose judgment gets sought by climbers and companies alike when a decision is genuinely beyond what anyone else currently available is qualified to make. You are, after 3 decades, one of them. A fact that still lands strangely on the mornings a younger guide introduces themselves at a conference by explaining, unprompted, that a technique you developed years ago is now simply how the entire industry trains for altitude illness recognition. You've trained more assistant guides than you can accurately count, and you recognize your own early mistakes in almost every one of them. The same overconfidence, the same reluctance to call a turnaround, the same slow, hard-won realization that patience is the actual skill this job has always been testing for. Freya retired several years ago, her knees finally ending a high-altitude career that had already outlasted almost everyone she'd started guiding alongside. And you visited her the following spring at a home with a clear view of mountains she no longer climbs, but still watches, daily, through a window, in a way that told you everything about how completely this profession had shaped her, even in retirement. You told her, that visit, about the client letter you'd kept from your very first season as an assistant guide, the one about finding a courage she didn't know she had. And Freya told you that letter was the actual reason to have done any of this, more than any summit either of you had ever reached. She asked if you still had it. You did, folded into the same battered notebook you'd carried since your apprenticeship, and reading it aloud to her on that visit, 3 decades later, was the closest either of you came to admitting out loud what the job had actually been for all along. You've lost clients and colleagues across 3 decades in numbers you can discuss factually, but never entirely without weight. And the specific arithmetic of a career built on leading people toward the most dangerous places on Earth has never fully stopped asking something of you that the money, considerable as it eventually became, was never really the full payment for. You keep a private list, the way guides at the top of every one of these worlds seem to eventually keep one, and you've stopped trying to explain to people outside the profession why keeping it feels less like grief and more like accounting for something that genuinely happened, rather than letting the mountain quietly erase it. The question this world never quite lets you answer is the one that matters most. Whether the courage you spent 3 decades helping strangers discover in themselves was ever really about the summit at all, or whether the mountain was always just the specific, unforgiving place you both happened to find it in. You still don't have a clean answer. You simply stopped needing one, the way Freya seemed to at that window overlooking mountains she'll never climb again, watching them anyway, every single day, because some part of the question stops mattering once you've spent a whole life inside it. 9 ranks, from $22,000 and a rope you were still learning to trust, to the person the world's wealthiest climbers call when only the best guide alive will do, and a private list and a battered notebook that was never for anyone else's eyes but your own. If worlds like this pull you in, there's another one waiting next week. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.